Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Min, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. So I will speak about AI and inequality. Let me start by sharing a couple of slides that I have prepared for that. Um, one moment. Can everybody see what I have shared?
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Great. All right, so I want to structure my presentation today into two parts. The first one is about general lessons from technology for inequality. And the second one will be a little bit more futuristic about preparing for the future or possibly non existent future of work. So let's start by a very fundamental question that people have asked for centuries, essentially since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. What are the effects of new technologies on the economy? Right now, everybody's worried about the effects of AI and closely related technologies, but ultimately, this is the same question that artisans have already been asking some 200, 250 years ago in Manchester, UK. Well, we know that at the time there was one story by a group of people that came to be called the Luddites was given. Their story was that, well, new technologies destroy jobs, and so we are all doomed because we lost our jobs as artisan weavers and spinners. Now, of course, we know nowadays that that was a little bit simplified, but perhaps it did also contain some grain of truth. The next story that I want to call perhaps the smart consensus story, uh, up until just a couple of years ago. So think about people like the discussions that people had in Davos. And there, the answer that people gave for the effects of new technologies on the economy was that, well, we know that new technologies will automate away simple and low paying jobs, but at the same time, they create new, more exciting and higher paying jobs. And as a result of that, there may be perhaps some transition costs along the way, but ultimately, the belief was that a rising tide would lift all boats. Well, what is the truth? The truth is that new technologies do lead to significant redistributions of income. And there is a whole spectrum of possible outcomes. So the economist John Hicks back in 1932 already came up with this categorization. 1932 was, of course, in the midst of the Great Depression. And nowadays we think of that mostly as something triggered by the financial crisis that ensued, the burst of the bubble of 1929. But another really significant factor at the time was the mechanization of agriculture. So within the span of 2, 3 decades, essentially half of the US population lost their jobs in agriculture due to mechanization and moved into other sectors of this economy. So that was an important part of the economic crisis at the time. And people were really concerned about that. So John Hicks at the time, one of the most famous economists of the 20th century, observed that technological progress can sometimes be neutral, by which he meant that it benefits everybody in society equally, but more generally, it will be biased in one direction or the other. It can be either labor using, as he called it, or it can be capital using or capital biased. If it is labor using, then it benefits the workers a little more. If it is capital using or capital biased, it benefits capital more at the expense of workers. And there's this whole spectrum, as I have shown on the slide, going from green to red. In particularly stark cases, technological progress can be so capital biased that it may actually reduce the absolute level of wages or employment. So that means we have progress, but workers are in fact worse off. So, to give just some tangible examples, uh, this is of course difficult to pin down, but one technological innovation that we have seen over the past decade or a little bit more already by now was ride sharing services. And these ride sharing services, you may have uh, some criticism on the companies that have started them, but overall, I think it is undeniable that they have created lots of job opportunities. They have increased the demand for labor, and in that sense, they have really been labor using. There's another innovation that is just on the horizon, and in fact has been just on the horizon for several years now. And by now, we don't believe that fully self-driving cars are just around the corner. But if we do develop autonomous vehicles, it is likely that the net effect of that will be labor saving or capital biased. It will most likely reduce labor demand and may even reduce the overall level of wages as a result of that. So, what this shows you is that different types of technological innovation can have very different effects on labor markets. Some can be really good labor using, others can be really bad for workers, labor saving. Now, a similar spectrum is of course possible not only for workers as a whole, but if we divide the labor market into different subsegments, so for example, if we look only at the market for lower skilled workers, it is well possible, and in fact, that's what we have observed in recent decades, that new technologies are biased against lower skilled workers. So, this is what automation and AI have done in the recent past, but the big question is, of course, in which direction will technological progress continue in the future? There's one little aside that I want to note, which is that in public discussions, you hear a lot of emphasis placed on this notion of how many jobs are created or lost by something. But from an economic perspective, that's actually a pretty bad guide for the effects of technologies on the labor market. So economists prefer to focus on labor demand, and they observe that that is mostly reflected in the level of wages. And the reason is what economists call a fairly inelastic labor supply. So, what does that mean? If labor supply is inelastic, it means essentially that people are willing to work no matter what the level of wages is. Let's say in really poor countries, people don't have choices. They have to work at the low wages that are prevailing there. In rich countries, people are working roughly the same amount at much, much higher wages. So it means the quantity of labor supplied doesn't really change a lot as you move from lower wages to higher wages. The only thing that changes is the quantity demanded as technologies change. So if you have changes in labor demand, but people always are willing to work roughly the same amount, then the number of jobs doesn't respond very much. And the main variable in which you will see the effects of technological change on the labor market is wages. So, what that implies is if we are concerned about labor saving innovations, we are not really that much concerned about unemployment because that's just a transition thing. But what we are really concerned is about declines in wages, which will still be there after the economy has adjusted to the labor saving innovation and after people who have become unemployed find jobs again. So, from that, let me move to a kind of broader question, which relates technological progress on the one hand and social welfare on the other hand. There is a fundamental theorem in economics which says that in a well-functioning market economy, technological progress can be decomposed into two parts. The first part is that there will be an increase in the overall income generated by the economy. That's why we call it technological progress. And in a well functioning economy, progress always means we will have more output overall. However, the second effect is that technological progress may create winners and may create losers. And in some cases, there may even be people who lose in absolute terms. So, what does that imply? As a result of these technological redistributions generated by new technologies, there may be political opposition to technological progress. And in fact, that's something that we have seen since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, for example, in the case of the Luddites that we started with in our presentation today. Now, if there is political opposition to technological progress, what that implies is there is a role for public policy to lean against these redistribution, to make people whole again, and as a result, to generate consensus in the economy. Because if the vast majority of people are ultimately beneficiaries, if we compensate the losers, make sure they're also taken care of, then there's no more reason to resist technological progress. So let me look a little bit at the data so that we get a sense for how technological progress has affected the US economy in recent decades. What you can see on this graph is that productivity in the US, which is the purple line here that is almost a 45-degree line, has gone up with little wiggles almost at a constant race over the past we may say 6 to 7 decades. If you look at the average compensation of workers, that has gone up at a slightly smaller pace. That's the blue line here. So the average compensation of workers has not quite kept up with overall labor productivity, but it's been close. However, where you see a really big gap is between productivity and the median compensation, which is the pink line here on the graph. So what that tells us is that the median compensation, which reflects the wages of the average worker, as it is sometimes called in popular parlance, has really not kept pace. And interestingly, this has been happening especially over the past 4 decades. For a few decades after World War II, we had inclusive economic growth in which everybody benefited equally here in essentially the first third of the time frame that is depicted. But after that, this wedge opened up and a large number of workers, more than half of workers, really didn't benefit from technological progress to the same extent that the economy as a whole benefited, which is what we measure here by overall productivity. I'll show you a second graph, which shows us the income shares of the top 1% and the top 0.1%. You can see kind of similar pattern here in this graph. For a few decades after World War II, the income share of the top 1%, of the top 0.1% stayed roughly the same, even declined a little bit. But then, starting in the 1980s and in particular 1990s, the income share of the top 1%, top 1%, top 0.1%, and we could zoom in into even smaller percentiles to get a sense of how stark this rise of inequality was focused on particularly the top earners. So we can see this inequality really went up quite significantly. Now, the traditional policy focus to respond to rising inequality has been more redistribution. So there was kind of this notion, let the market do its job, let the market distribute the income in whichever way is efficient, and after that impose taxes and redistribute. Well, the interesting thing is that in practice, our tax and social insurance systems in the US have actually become less progressive and have magnified the increase in inequality that was generated by the market in recent decades. So there has been a new focus in the past few years, which is, I would say, complementary and equally, if not more important. And that is sometimes captured by this new password, which is pre-distribution instead of redistribution. So the idea of pre-distribution is to engage in measures to affect how the market itself distributes resources. For example, in measures that make market wages um, more equal. Now, a key question, if we want to engage in this type of pre-distribution for innovators, is a given innovation labor using or labor saving? Is it biased in favor of capital or biased in favor of labor? And if we want to engage in this form of pre-distribution so that we don't need to tax and redistribute as much and still have an inclusive society, then that is in a way the central question. So how do we do this? How do we engage in pre-distribution and steer technological progress in a direction that benefits workers? Well, I have a paper on that which is available on my website. It is called a technological impact assessment. And in that paper, I develop a very tangible framework that anybody who is interested in evaluating the effects of new technologies on the labor market can apply. So you don't need an economics PhD for that. Any AI lab that is developing new products and wants to know what's the effect on workers can go through essentially a 5-step procedure that is outlined there. And I will give you a quick summary of that now in our presentation here. The first step is to ascertain what are the direct effects. So within your company or within the company that is employing your AI system, how many jobs will be created or displaced if everything else is held unchanged? The second question is if what you are doing becomes cheaper because of your new technology, because of your more efficient AI system, or because your AI system is now suddenly much better, how will the demand for your product go up? And will that create additional jobs? A third question, which I call the vertical effects. If you produce more, if you create more output, are there also people in your supply chain affected? So if you generate a lot more output and you buy more uh, ingredients for your product, how many jobs will that generate upstream, essentially? The fourth effect, horizontal effects. How does it affect your competitors? Will they have to let go of people? And in the end, will that perhaps undo many of the positive effects of your innovation? And then the fifth effect is essentially taking care of the general equilibrium of the economy. It sounds complicated to non-economists, but in my paper there is a very simple and straightforward algorithm to go through this. So essentially, if we employ new workers in these effects 1, 2, 3, 4, or if we displace new workers in the first 4 effects, where will those workers go or where will the new workers come from? And how will that in turn affect wages? So that's the general equilibrium de facto reallocation effect, which captures what happens when the economy goes back into its equilibrium. So let me give you a tangible example of this, which a co-author of mine at the Partnership on AI has developed to put this framework into practice. And in particular, she applied it to a company that introduces chatbots. And this is a very specific example now, to replace a certain fraction of workers in a call service center. So my co-author went through all these five effects here, and I won't go through every detail. This is again in a paper on my website. But what she found is there are some labor markets, some geographies, and skill levels of workers that are affected negatively. Those are illustrated by the downward pink arrows. And then there are others who are affected positively, which is illustrated by the upward blue arrows. So, for example, our chatbot here will reduce jobs of call service workers in North America, in the Philippines, in India. But those are mostly people who don't have college degrees, who are lesser skilled. However, it will increase job prospects of people on the coasts in North America, let's say programmers working in the Valley, working in New York City, as some of you are, perhaps also in the UK, in Europe. Uh, and in addition, it will increase the returns of capital. So that's captured by this last blue arrow here on the right side. I'll show you a second example on which I have put numbers. I won't walk you through every detail, but I thought it may be interesting. This example goes through all of these effects in the case of a fast food company that replaces 10% of its workforce with burger flipping machines. And you can see I have a spreadsheet here in which I take care of all these effects. It's essentially something like a very basic income statement. And I first look at the direct effects, the demand effects as our product gets cheaper, the vertical effects, which looks at our suppliers, horizontal effects, looks at our competitors. The end result is the upshot that unskilled workers in this example lose about 200 million in wages, 200 million US dollars, that is, and those benefits go to skilled workers as well as to the owners of capital. So you can see by following this very tangible procedure, you can ascertain what are the overall equilibrium effects of a specific innovation on job markets. Now, how can we implement this in practice? We know how to calculate the effects, but how do we make sure that it actually will be calculated? Well, the first step is I believe we need to create more awareness for the redistributive effects of innovation. We need to nudge innovators, make them aware that this is happening, that it's not just cool if you automate the jobs of lower skilled workers, but it has actually tangible economic effects on them. We also can create awareness among the consumers of these products. Uh, I believe, as a second point, we should also focus on the distributive effects of government spending on innovation, government sponsored research. So, just like we want to make sure that the research sponsored by, let's say, the NSF, the NIH, does not create toxic substances that land in our rivers, we also want to make sure that it doesn't undermine the livelihood of workers, or it doesn't undermine it too much without proper compensation. A third way of implementing this is to allow for more stakeholder participation in the decision making process, to elicit the input of workers, to make sure that they also have a seat on the table. And in many cases, automation decisions can be made in a way that is more benign to workers, and may not even necessarily hurt the bottom lines of corporations. So, one area from which I have drawn inspiration in this is the green movement. 10 years ago, I think it was still hard to conceive that lots of corporations will make serious sacrifices to essentially enhance their contribution to a green environment. But in the last few years, some corporations actually have, and this effort has really taken off. I believe we need a similar movement when it comes to labor using innovation, when it comes to making sure that the latest cool AI product that we develop doesn't undermine the livelihoods of workers. And it's possible because we have seen that a couple slides ago. There's many examples of innovations that benefit workers. It doesn't always have to be labor saving. Um, so what I want to talk about in the second part of my presentation is that, well, I do believe that in the short to medium term, we really should be concerned about the labor market impacts of our innovation. I also believe, however, that in the long run, there is a non-negligible chance that machines may be able to do everything that we humans can do as workers. And in that sense, that labor may actually become redundant. And I think it would be a mistake to completely discount that possibility. I think it's important for our society to start and prepare for it. So, oftentimes, when people frame that concern, they observe that at some level, what the human brain does and what AI does is both computation. Both systems take in inputs and emit outputs. In that sense, both systems are essentially computers. Now we know that at present, we humans are still the best general supercomputers out there, but we also know from regularities such as Moore's law, whether it still holds to the dot or whether it has slowed down a little bit, that's kind of irrelevant for our point here. Computers are still advancing relentlessly, and some predict that the two may reach parity in the not so far future. So, what's the economic dimension of that? That's that it may really fundamentally undermine the future of work. And that has several important economic and social implications. So, right now, work plays several important roles in our society. First, it's the main source of income for the majority of people. Second, it's the main way in which most of us spend our time. Third, and this is also really crucial for public policy, labor is also the main target of taxation, and the majority of our government revenue relies on it. So, if AI systems at some point in the future supplant labor, all three of these roles are threatened or perhaps even lost. And I think we have to start now to think about it and to prepare for it. So let me perhaps formulate the concerns that technologists oftentimes express about the future of work, the long term future of work, in the way that economists would phrase it. I think the first concern is that labor may become technologically substitutable, that we just don't need labor anymore for production. And that would occur if machines can do everything that can be done by humans. Now, I want to emphasize we care not only if it is feasible for machines to do something, we also care about whether it is cost effective as economists. Now, when is it cost effective? And that's where concern two comes in. I told you earlier in our presentation that ultimately the effects of technological progress on the labor market is reflected in wages much more than in the number of jobs out there. But the concern through this lens is essentially that the wages of workers may fall to a really low level and in the extreme may fall to a level that's below the subsistence cost of workers. So if that was true, it would no longer be feasible to survive solely based on work. And that would be a radical departure from the way that our society has been organized for the past 250 years, if not for the past 10,000 years. So, what I want to do now to facilitate our discussion, I want to invite you for a quick poll that asks you essentially to share what you think about the potential redundancy of labor, what you view as the main objections, because I think that would be a great basis for us to structure our discussion around. So let me leave up this slide for a few moments and let me see. By the way, Min, can you access the QR code?
Yes, got it. Yeah,
Great.
yeah. And,
So then let me take a 30-second break to see what you are thinking about the objections to the potential redundancy of human labor.
yeah, I replied.
I see some results trickling in. Thank you very much. It's great. If you have not gone through everything yet, um, you can press the submit button whenever you feel like it. I will actually leave the poll open for the next couple of minutes and talk about a few other things so that we can have this discussion for the end. Um, so let me proceed in my presentation. What I want to do next is I want to talk about a simple analysis for how we should allocate both labor and income in the world as a function of the level of technology and as a function of how much capital and labor income there is. So this is a simple economic model that is represented here, but don't worry, you don't need to have a background in economics because I will explain all parts of it. So you can see two axes here on this graph. On the horizontal axis, you see the amount of non-labor income that a specific agent receives. You can think of that simply as transfers that the agents get, but it could also be, for example, capital income. On the vertical axis, you see the labor productivity or the wage level that the agent receives. And then you see C0 here, which is the subsistence income that the agent has. What our graph here shows is that there may be 3 to 4 regions for the economy as a function for how our technologies develop. So first, and this is kind of the depressing one, if our wage or technology is less than the subsistence, our wage or transfer income is less than the subsistence incomes of agents, they will perish. They just don't have enough to meet their subsistence needs. However, as their wages, their marginal product of labor rises, they will have enough to survive and they will work first out of need. And then, if they also have non labor income, capital income, or transfers, they move to the right in this diagram. So they work out of choice. And after that, if the capital income or transfer income rises and they move further to the right, they will move below this line here that I have labeled W bar, which I call the reservation wage level of these agents. and they will enter into a region where they no longer find it optimal to work. So if their non-labor income is high enough and their wage isn't too high, then it is actually optimal for these agents not to work. They have, in some sense, you can say, comparative advantage in enjoying their leisure, and it would be a waste both for the individual and for society as a whole to make individuals work in that case. So this is just to look at the essentially possibilities for one individual. In the second part of this model, I want to go over the possibilities if you have a whole society of agents who differ in their wage income or who differ in how much the market values their labor. Economists call it the marginal product of their labor. And imagine that we arrange all these agents by growing labor productivity or growing earning potential from W min to W max. So they are represented by this kind of bold line here on the horizontal axis. And imagine we are in a world where at first this solid curved line holds. What does this line tell us? Well, on the vertical axis, I've depicted how much is optimal to work for these agents. And what the solid line here tells us is that all the agents between W min to W max, from the lowest to the highest earnings potential, should be working. They should be working an increasing amount. So those who have the highest earnings potential, who have the highest marginal product, who create the most productivity for society, they should work the most. Those who don't have that high of an earnings potential should work less. Now, what happens if technology in this economy advances and we move from the solid line? So, if technology advances or labor gets more and more displaced, we move to the dashed curved line here, which you see in the middle where W2 bar starts. It turns out with more advanced technologies or with a lower role for labor, it becomes optimal to phase out workers, first those with the lowest earnings potential, those with the lowest labor productivity, and we only make the high productivity workers still continue to work. Now, if technology advances further and we become even richer as a society, or labor becomes valuable even less, then we end up in the dotted line where it has become optimal for everybody to stop working, and we would simply let autonomous machines accomplish all the work in our society. So this kind of captures the potential transition into a future in which there's no more role for human labor, and this framework kind of tells us how to optimally phase out labor if that is the case. So let me stop with the economic models now and just observe one more point. Well, work is not only about giving up time to earn money, but it also involves what economists often call job amenities. Job amenities are other things that we derive from work. For example, our identity, the structure that it provides to our daily routines. It may provide meaning, social connections, and so on. So if we earn positive amenities, if these side effects, these non-economic effects of work are positive, then that may actually compensate for some of our wage income. And for some workers, it may be even desirable to work when their wages would go to zero. However, I don't think that would be true for the majority. So in surveys, two-thirds of workers routinely report that they are either disengaged or not engaged from work. And that implies that such workers probably don't perceive they are getting a lot of amenities from their work. So the question is, should we just hand out benefits if the future of work ceases to exist and let agents choose whether to work or not? So that's what lots of people would advocate. Lots of people say, well, let's introduce a UBI, and then people can choose whether they still want to work or not. However, there's one more factor I want to emphasize, which is what economists call externalities. And that may create a role for policy intervention beyond just providing transfers if the future of work ceases to exist. So, in particular, job amenities may be subject to both externalities and internalities. So, what are externalities, or sometimes we could also call it public amenities? Those are factors, non pecuniary factors that are generated by labor that are not taken into account by the individual. For example, the social connections at work. If you are the only one showing up to your job in the office, some of us have had that experience now during COVID. There aren't a lot of social connections. Social connections always require multiple people, and we can only have this positive value that we derive from social connections if there are multiple people. And that means that's a positive externality. There may be some reason to incentivize people coming together to work. Some also say that work increases political stability because our society is structured around this notion that everybody has a role in the form of work. Now, there may also be negative externalities, for example, from commuting, congestion that's generated by commuting. The more people work, the worse the congestion. And I think you in New York City are acutely aware of that. Uh, Aside from externalities, there may also be internalities generated by work. Now, this is a term that may not be familiar to everybody. What is an internality? An internality is something that affects an individual, but the individual may not be rationally taking it into account because of bounded rationality. So, for example, I may really benefit from the structure that my work provides to me day in and day out, but I don't realize that because I have bounded rationality. Or on the other hand, I may actually be working too much because of workaholism, and I may be better off if I didn't work enough. If such internalities are at play, that also provides a public policy role to either encourage work or, in the case of negative internalities, to discourage work. So, in the medium run, if we do need to phase out work, I think such types of public policy intervention may be really quite important. However, in the long run, I would ask, can we not find better ways to deliver these public amenities, these public goods, and adapt our society to a world in which there is less or no work if the future of work becomes non existent? So let me conclude now, and then I will show you the survey results. Uh, what I observed is technology determines how much our society can produce, and technological progress increases how much we produce. However, it is our institutions that determine how that output is distributed. In the short to medium term, I think it is really important to steer technology to use labor as long as it is useful. However, in the medium to long term, I believe we also need to prepare for the potential that the future of work does not exist. And in order to be prepared for that, we need to ensure an equitable income distribution, for example, through some sort of basic income support. And we will also have to adapt our social norms to supplant the central role of labor in our society. And as my last words giving for my main talk now, I will quote Arthur C. Clarke, who said several decades ago already, the goal of the future is full unemployment so that we can play. Okay,
Thank
so
you.
this was my main presentation, and now I will stop and I will quickly share the survey results.